Part 1. The ocean remembers. Long before satellites, engines, or borders, the Atlantic carried secrets so dark that even the waves tried to bury them. This is not a story of ships and trade. This is a story of women. African women whose suffering was hidden beneath wooden decks, salt air and silence. At night, when the sea was calm and the stars were bright, something unspeakable happened on British slave ships. Something that history books often reduce to a single word: slavery. But slavery was not a word. It was a system of terror, and women suffered it differently. It began on land. Villages burned at dawn. Families were torn apart before they could even understand what was happening. Women were dragged away, some pregnant, some holding children, some barely older than girls. Their crime was existence. They were marched for weeks to the coast, chained together, starving, beaten, and watched. By the time they reached the sea, many could no longer remember the sound of their own village. And then they saw the ships, floating wooden monsters, tall masts, iron chains, men who spoke a language that sounded like knives scraping stone. British slave ships were not built for people. They were built for profit. Below deck, the air was thick and hot. There was barely room to sit, let alone lie down. Women were separated from men, not for protection but for control. They were inspected like animals. Teeth, skin, bodies. Some women were marked as valuable, not because of strength, but because of what could be taken from them. When the sun disappeared, fear grew louder. Chains rattled. Waves hit the hull like slow drumbeats. Oil lamps flickered. This is when the real terror began. British sailors, armed, drunk, and untouchable, walked the decks. They chose women as if selecting objects. Resistance meant punishment. Screams meant nothing in the middle of the ocean. There were no laws at sea, no witnesses, no escape. Some women fought, some prayed, some went silent. Every night felt endless. The sea heard everything. The ocean swallowed cries. It carried tears. It watched bodies thrown overboard, women who refused to survive this way. Some jumped, some were pushed. Pregnant women were not spared. Mothers were not spared. Age offered no protection. To the traders, these women were property. To history, they became numbers, but each one had a name. Those who survived the nights faced the mornings. Infections spread. Wounds festered. Shame was weaponized. Women were blamed for what was done to them, punished if they cried, punished if they resisted, punished if they became ill. Some gave birth at sea, children born into chains, onto blood-stained decks, surrounded by death. The ship kept moving. Profit demanded it. When land finally appeared, hope died again. Markets waited. Auctions waited. New owners waited. What happened at sea did not end on shore. It followed them into plantations, into forced labor, into generations of pain. The nights at sea became lifelong scars. For centuries, these stories were minimized, ignored, erased. British records spoke of cargo loss, weather damage, financial risk, never of women's suffering. But memory survives where ink fails, in songs, in silence, in inherited trauma. The ocean did not forget, and this is only the beginning. Because what happened every night at sea was not just cruelty. It was a system designed to break women completely. And in the next part of this story, we will reveal how resistance survived, how women protected each other, and why this history still matters today. But even in the darkest holds of those ships, something unexpected survived. Not hope, defiance. African women were not only victims, they were witnesses, and sometimes they were resistors. When open rebellion meant death, resistance took quieter forms. Women memorized faces. They memorized voices. They memorized cruelty, not to accept it, but to remember it. Some refused food even when starving, choosing death over submission. Others whispered prayers in languages their captors could not understand. Languages older than the ships, older than the empire that tried to erase them. At night, when the lamps dimmed, women pressed close together, not out of fear alone, but protection. They sang softly. They told stories of home. They reminded each other that they were still human. On the lower decks, bonds formed that slavery never intended. Older women shielded younger ones when they could. Mothers shared water with strangers' children. Women cleaned wounds with salt water, knowing infection could mean death. These acts did not stop the horror, but they denied it victory. Because slavery wanted isolation, and they chose connection. British traders noticed something. Women who stood together were harder to break. Women who remembered their past were harder to control. So punishments grew harsher, chains tighter, rules stricter. But fear works both ways. The traders feared rebellion. They feared poison. They feared mutiny. And most of all, they feared memory, because memory outlives empires. When these ships finally docked, the traders counted profits. But the women carried something else. Invisible wounds, stolen futures, nightmares that crossed oceans. Many would never speak of what happened at sea, not because it didn't matter, but because words were not enough. Trauma passed from mother to child. Silence became inheritance, and still history tried to move on. This is why these stories matter, because slavery was not just chains and labor. It was psychological warfare. It was gendered violence. It was systematic dehumanization. And African women endured it at the most vulnerable place imaginable, alone on the open ocean. To forget them is to repeat the lie that slavery was only economics. It was not. It was lives. Look at the sea long enough and you realize something. It does not speak, but it remembers. Every wave crosses the paths of those ships. Every tide moves over unmarked graves. The Atlantic is not just water. It is a mass grave, a witness, a keeper of truth. Part 2. When the ships finally reached land, the nightmare did not end. It evolved. The women were forced onto unfamiliar shores, places where the air smelled different. The language sounded cold, and mercy did not exist. Auction blocks replaced ship decks. Chains were polished. Bodies were cleaned, not out of care, but for sale. British traders called it commerce. History would later call it civilization. But the women knew the truth. This was not a rival. This was another captivity. Plantations across the Americas demanded labor, but they also demanded obedience. African women were forced to work the fields by day and surrender their bodies by night. They were breeders, servants, property. Their children were born into ownership. Their pain normalized, their resistance punished. And yet, something dangerous happened. Women remembered. They remembered Africa. They remembered the ocean. They remembered the ships. And memory became rebellion. They taught children forbidden languages. They passed down stories in whispers. They hid identity inside lullabies. The slave system depended on forgetting. African women refused. British records show something strange. Plantation owners complained. Traders panicked. Empires worried. Not about morality, but about loss of control. Women were accused of witchcraft, of poisoning, of rebellion. Why? Because a woman who remembers her humanity is more dangerous than chains. Centuries later, textbooks softened the story. They spoke of trade routes, economic growth, industrial progress. They did not speak of night screams at sea. They did not speak of women whose names were never written down. Europe called itself enlightened. While standing on stolen lives, America called itself free. While built by the enslaved, modern ships now cross the same waters. Tourists take photos. Cruise lines sell sunsets. But beneath those waves, millions never made it back. The Atlantic is the largest crime scene in human history, with no memorial big enough to hold the truth. Look around today. Racial inequality, generational trauma, voices still fighting to be believed. None of this appeared from nowhere. It was planted on ships, in chains, through women who were forced to survive the impossible. British slave traders believed the ocean erased evidence. They were wrong. The ocean remembers. The descendants remember. And now, you remember? Because the most horrifying thing about this history is not what happened. It's how long the world tried to pretend it didn't. This story ends here, but its consequences do not. If this story disturbed you, it should have. If it made you uncomfortable, it was meant to, because comfort is a privilege history did not give them.